Hello, and welcome to today's story. My name is Philip, and I like to dive deep into scary Asian stories and cover them in my videos. If you have an interesting story you want me to cover, let me know in the comments. I always read all comments. For now, let's get into today's story, where we have a few terrifying stories to share. One of them is this story. Adele had always been drawn to places with history, the kind that lingered in walls and whispered through empty corridors. When her tour brought her to Japan, she made a deliberate choice to avoid the modern hotels of Tokyo and instead found herself at a traditional ryokan nestled in the hills outside Kyoto. The place was recommended by someone on her team, described as peaceful, authentic, a refuge from the chaos of performing night after night. What no one mentioned was the silence that felt too thick, the way the gardens seemed to hold their breath after sunset, or how the staff would avoid direct eye contact when guiding guests to certain rooms. She arrived late in the afternoon, the autumn light turning everything golden and soft. The owner, an elderly woman with hands like folded paper, greeted her with a bow so low it seemed reverent. Adele was led down a long wooden hallway, her footsteps muted by tatami mats, until they reached a room at the very end. The door was a delicate lattice of wood and rice paper, and when it slid open, she saw a space that seemed untouched by time. A low table sat in the center, a single scroll hung on the wall depicting a lone crane in flight, and beyond the paper screens, a private garden glowed in the fading light. It was perfect, almost too perfect, like a painting you were not supposed to step into. The owner explained the amenities in quiet, careful English, gesturing toward the futon that would be laid out later, the small alcove for tea, the wooden bath in the adjoining room. Adele thanked her and set down her bags, already feeling the weight of the tour lifting from her shoulders. She had 2 days here before the next show, 2 days to breathe and be still. The owner lingered at the doorway for a moment, her expression unreadable, before bowing again and sliding the door shut. Adele stood alone in the room, listening to the faint rustle of leaves outside, the distant trickle of water from a stone fountain. She walked to the window and looked out at the garden, where stone lanterns stood like silent sentinels among the moss and ferns. Everything felt serene, carefully arranged, as though the world outside this room did not exist. She unpacked slowly, placing her things in the small wooden chest, hanging her coat on a lacquered hook. The air smelled faintly of incense, something sweet and woody that she could not quite place. As evening settled in, the staff brought dinner on a lacquered tray, delicate portions of fish and rice, and vegetables arranged with an artistry that made her hesitate before eating. They bowed and left without a word, and she ate in silence. The only sound, the soft scrape of chopsticks against ceramic. When she finished, she set the tray outside the door as instructed and prepared for bed, slipping into the simple cotton yukata provided by the inn. The futon had been laid out while she was bathing, the sheets crisp and cool, the pillow filled with something that smelled like buckwheat. She lay down and stared at the ceiling, tracing the grain of the wood beams with her eyes, feeling the kind of exhaustion that goes deeper than the body. Sleep came quickly, pulling her under like a tide. She woke to the sound of humming. At first, it seemed part of a dream, a melody that drifted through the edges of consciousness, soft and lilting, almost lullaby-like. But as she opened her eyes, the sound did not fade. It was real, coming from somewhere just beyond her door, a woman's voice, low and unhurried, repeating the same phrase over and over. Adele lay still, listening, her heart beginning to quicken. The humming was not cheerful or comforting. It had a hollow quality, as though the person singing was alone, and had been for a very long time. She sat up slowly, the futon rustling beneath her, and looked toward the sliding door. The hallway beyond was dark, but she could see a faint glow, the kind cast by a single lantern. The humming continued, steady and unchanging, and she realized it was not moving. Whoever was out there was standing in one place. She thought perhaps it was a staff member, someone preparing for the morning or checking on the rooms, though it seemed strange to do so in the middle of the night. Adele stood and walked to the door, her bare feet silent on the tatami. She hesitated, her hand on the wooden frame, listening. The humming was clearer now, close enough that she could almost make out the tune, something old and mournful. She slid the door open just a crack and peered into the hallway. At first, she saw nothing but shadows and the flicker of a lantern hanging from a wooden post. Then, slowly, her eyes adjusted, and she saw the figure. A woman stood at the far end of the hallway, her back to Adele, wearing a kimono that seemed to shimmer in the dim light, deep red with gold embroidery that caught the flame. Her hair was pinned up in an elaborate style, held in place by what looked like long ornamental pins. She stood perfectly still, her posture formal and rigid, and the humming came from her, soft and continuous, as though she had been standing there for hours. Adele opened the door wider, stepping into the hallway, and called out softly, asking if everything was all right. The humming stopped. The silence that followed was immediate and absolute, as though the air itself had been cut. The woman did not turn, did not move, and Adele felt a coldness settle over her skin, a prickling awareness that something was deeply wrong. She took a step forward, her voice a little louder now, asking again if the woman needed help. Still, no response. The figure remained motionless, and Adele noticed now that the edges of the kimono seemed blurred, as though she were looking at her through old glass. She blinked, trying to clear her vision, and in that instant, the woman was gone. Not walking away, not turning a corner, simply gone, as though she had never been there at all. The lantern still flickered. The hallway still stretched into darkness, but the space where the woman had stood was empty. Adele stood frozen, her breath shallow, her mind trying to make sense of what she had just seen. She stepped forward, moving to the spot where the figure had been, and looked around, searching for any sign of movement, any door that might have opened. There was nothing. The hallway was silent, the other rooms closed and dark. No footsteps, no voices, no indication that anyone else was awake. She touched the wall where the woman had stood, half expecting it to feel different, but it was just wood, cool and smooth under her palm. She stood there for a long moment, her heart pounding, before turning and walking quickly back to her room. She slid the door shut and pressed her back against it, breathing hard, telling herself it had been a trick of the light, exhaustion playing games with her mind. But she knew what she had seen, the way the woman had stood, the texture of the kimono, the sound of that humming, so clear and close. She did not sleep again that night. She sat on the futon, her knees pulled to her chest, watching the door, waiting for the sound to return. It never did, but the silence felt heavier now, filled with a presence she could not name. When the first light of dawn crept through the paper screens, she finally allowed herself to relax, though the unease did not leave. She dressed quickly and left the room, walking down the hallway in the daylight, searching for any clue, any explanation. The lantern that had been lit the night before was gone, and the hallway looked different, smaller and more ordinary. She found the owner in the main room, preparing tea, and hesitated before approaching. The old woman looked up and smiled, a gentle, knowing expression that made Adele's stomach tighten. She asked carefully if anyone else had been in the hallway last night, if any staff worked through the early morning hours. The owner's smile faded slightly, and she set down the teapot, folding her hands in her lap. She asked which room Adele had stayed in, and when Adele told her, the woman nodded slowly, as though she had expected this. She explained, in quiet, measured words, that many years ago, a geisha had lived in that room. She had been beautiful and talented, admired by many, but she had fallen deeply in love with a man who promised her everything and gave her nothing. When he left her for another, she took her own life in that room, hanging herself from the ceiling beam in the stillness of the night. The owner paused, her eyes distant, and said that since then, guests had reported strange things, the sound of humming, the sight of a woman in a red kimono, always standing, always still, always waiting. Adele felt the air leave her lungs. She asked why she had not been told, why no one had warned her, and the owner simply bowed her head, saying that some guests never saw anything, and it was not their place to speak of ghosts to those who did not believe. Adele left the room without another word, returning to gather her things. She did not want to stay another night, did not want to close her eyes in that room again, knowing what had happened there, knowing that the woman might return. As she packed, she felt it again, that sensation of being watched, not threatening, but mournful, as though something was standing just beyond her vision, waiting for acknowledgement. She glanced toward the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed darker than they should be, and for a brief, terrible moment, she thought she saw the outline of a figure, the faint shimmer of red fabric. She looked away quickly, refusing to let her eyes confirm what her mind already knew. She finished packing in silence, her hands shaking, and left the ryokan before noon, telling the owner she had been called back to Tokyo for an unexpected meeting. The old woman did not argue, only bowed and wished her well, her expression sad and understanding. As Adele's car pulled away, she looked back at the building, at the row of windows facing the garden, and she could have sworn she saw a figure standing in one of them, motionless and watching. She did not look again. Later, when asked about her time in Kyoto, she would only say that the ryokan was beautiful, but that she had never felt so watched in her life, as though the walls themselves had eyes. She never returned, and she never spoke in detail about what she had seen, but those who knew her said she seemed different after that trip, more cautious, more aware of the spaces between the living and the dead. Some places, she realized, hold on to their sorrow, and some sorrows never let go. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. But as unsettling as that encounter was, it is far from the only time a well-known figure has crossed paths with something unexplainable. In another corner of Asia, in the crowded, humid streets of Manila, a different kind of presence made itself known. This time, the setting was not a quiet ryokan steeped in history, but an old Spanish-era apartment building where the past refuses to stay buried. What happened there reminded one man that the boundary between the living and the dead is thinner than we like to believe, and that some spirits linger not out of malice, but out of an inability to leave. Keanu Reeves had always preferred quiet accommodations, places where he could disappear into the background and avoid the noise that came with fame. When he arrived in Manila for a charity project, a documentary highlighting the resilience of communities affected by natural disasters, he turned down the luxury hotel his team had arranged, and instead rented a small apartment in Intramuros, the old walled city. The building was centuries old, its walls thick and crumbling in places, the kind of structure that had survived wars and occupations and countless generations. The locals who saw him moving in exchanged glances, some shaking their heads, others whispering warnings that he politely ignored. He liked the authenticity of the place, the way the wooden floors creaked under his weight, the way the windows opened onto narrow streets filled with the smell of street food and incense. It felt real in a way that sterile hotel rooms never did. The apartment itself was modest, a single large room with high ceilings, a small kitchen area, and a bathroom that looked like it had been added as an afterthought. The furniture was old but sturdy, a wooden table and chairs, a narrow bed with a thin mattress, a bookshelf filled with books in Tagalog that he could not read. The walls were painted a faded yellow, and there were water stains in the corners where the roof had leaked during past storms. It was not glamorous, but it was private, and that was all he needed. The owner of the building, an elderly man named Mang Carlos, had been hesitant to rent to him at first, asking several times if he was sure, if he understood that the building was old, that things were not always as they seemed. Keanu had smiled and assured him it was fine, that he appreciated the history, that he was not afraid of a little wear and tear. Mang Carlos had nodded slowly, his expression troubled, and handed over the keys without further comment. Keanu settled in quickly, spending his days filming interviews and visiting communities, and his evenings reviewing footage and preparing for the next day. The crimes saw the resend of Cryle. The apartment was quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy and present. At night, he would sit at the wooden table by the window, his laptop open, the glow of the screen the only light in the room. The street below would empty as the hours passed, the sounds of the city fading into the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. He liked the solitude, the sense of being removed from everything, though sometimes he felt an odd awareness, as though the room was listening. He would glance up from his work, scanning the corners, but there was never anything there, just shadows and the faint movement of curtains in the breeze. On his third night, he was reviewing scripts when he noticed a smell, faint at first but growing stronger, the scent of burning candles, the kind used in churches, waxy and slightly sweet. He looked around, thinking perhaps a neighbor was holding a prayer service, but the smell seemed to be coming from inside the apartment. He stood and walked through the space, checking the small kitchen, the bathroom, the corners where the smell might be trapped, but he found nothing. He opened the windows wider, letting in the humid night air, and the scent faded slightly, though it never disappeared entirely. He returned to his work, chalking it up to the age of the building, old wood and plaster holding on to decades of accumulated smells. An hour later he felt it, a shift in the air, subtle but undeniable, as though someone had entered the room. He looked up from the screen, his eyes adjusting to the darkness beyond the circle of light cast by his laptop. At first he saw nothing, just the familiar shapes of furniture and the faint outline of the window. Then, slowly, his gaze settled on the far corner of the room, near the window, and he saw a figure. A man stood there, facing away, his posture formal and still. He was wearing a barong Tagalog, the traditional Filipino shirt, made of delicate embroidered fabric that seemed to catch the faint light from the street. The man's hair was dark and neatly combed, his hands clasped behind his back, and he stood as though he were waiting for something, or someone. Keanu's first thought was that it was a crew member, someone who had let themselves in to drop off equipment or leave a message, though that did not make sense. The door was locked, and no one had knocked. He called out, asking if everything was okay, his voice steady but cautious. The figure did not respond, did not turn, did not move at all. Keanu stood up, pushing his chair back, the legs scraping against the wooden floor, and took a step closer. He said the person's name, assuming it might be one of the producers, but again, there was no reaction. The man remained motionless, his form solid and clear, not a trick of shadow or light. Keanu moved closer, close enough now that he should have been able to reach out and touch the figure's shoulder, and that was when he noticed the edges, the man's outline. seemed slightly blurred, as though he were standing behind a pane of frosted glass, and the longer Keanu looked, the more he realized that the figure was not quite solid, not quite there. His heart began to pound, a cold realization settling over him, and he stopped moving, his breath shallow. He whispered a question, asking who the man was, what he wanted, his voice barely audible. The figure remained still, and then, slowly, it began to fade. Not disappearing all at once, but dissolving, the edges softening until there was nothing left but the empty corner and the faint, lingering smell of burning candles. Keanu stood frozen, his mind racing, trying to process what he had just seen. He walked to the corner, reaching out to touch the space where the figure had been, half expecting to feel something, a coldness, a presence, but there was nothing. The wall was solid, the air undisturbed. He turned and looked at the rest of the room, suddenly, acutely aware of how alone he was, how old and silent the building felt around him. He checked the door, confirming it was still locked, then checked the windows, but everything was secure. There was no rational explanation for what he had seen, no way someone could have been standing there and then simply vanished. He sat back down at the table, his hands shaking slightly, and tried to return to his work, but the words on the screen blurred together, meaningless. He kept glancing toward the corner, expecting the figure to reappear, but it did not. The smell of candles lingered for hours, faint but persistent, and he did not sleep that night. He sat in the chair, watching the room, listening to every creak and rustle, waiting for something to happen. Nothing did, but the sense of being watched never left. The next morning, he went downstairs and found Mang Carlos sweeping the courtyard. The old man looked up as Keanu approached, his expression wary, as though he already knew what was coming. Keanu asked, as casually as he could manage, if anyone else had stayed in the apartment recently, if there had been any reports of unusual activity. Mang Carlos stopped sweeping and leaned on the broom, his eyes distant. He asked if Keanu had seen something, and when Keanu hesitated, the old man nodded slowly, as though the silence was answer enough. He explained that the building had a long history, that during World War II it had been occupied by soldiers, and many families had hidden in the apartments, trying to survive the bombings. One family, he said, had lived in the unit Keanu was staying in, a father, a mother, and 3 children. When the bombs fell, the building was hit, and the family was killed instantly, trapped inside as the structure collapsed around them. Mang Carlos paused, his voice quiet, and said that ever since, people had reported seeing a man in traditional clothing standing by the window, as though he were still waiting for the danger to pass, still watching over his family. Keanu felt a chill run through him, the image of the figure in the Barong Tagalog now taking on a new, heartbreaking context. He asked why Mang Carlos had not mentioned this before, and the old man simply shrugged, saying that some people needed to experience things for themselves, that words alone were never enough. Keanu thanked him and returned to the apartment, though he no longer felt comfortable there. He spent the rest of his time in Manila finishing the project, but he never stayed another night in that room. He moved to a hotel, telling his team that the apartment was too far from the filming locations, though those close to him sensed there was more to it. Years later, in a quiet conversation, he would mention the experience, describing it not with fear but with a kind of reverent sadness. He said it reminded him how thin the wall between the living and the dead could be, how some people never truly leave the places they loved or the places where they suffered. He spoke of the man in the Barong Tagalog with a strange respect, as though acknowledging that the figure had not been trying to frighten him, but simply existing in the only way it still could. The apartment in Intramuros remains occupied, and Mang Carlos still rents it out, though he always warns new tenants about the building's history, about the man who stands by the window, waiting. Some leave after a single night, others stay and learn to live with the presence, understanding that not all hauntings are malevolent, that some are simply echoes of lives that ended too soon, too suddenly, and refuse to be forgotten. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow, we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best. And while these stories already seem unbelievable, what comes next takes horror to a darker and more mysterious level. Because in the next part, the things that begin as coincidences twist into something far more terrifying. There are places in Asia where the past does not simply linger, it reaches out, pulls people in, and refuses to let them go unchanged. What follows is not just about seeing something unexplainable, it is about being touched by it, marked by it, and carrying that mark long after the encounter ends. The next story will show us that some experiences do not end when you walk away, they follow you home. Kendall Jenner had learned to sleep anywhere, backstage dressing rooms, airport lounges, cramped hotel suites between shows, but something about the room in Shanghai felt wrong from the moment she stepped inside. It was not the kind of wrong you could point to, not a smell or a sound or anything visible, just a feeling that settled in her chest like cold water. She told herself it was exhaustion, the relentless pace of Fashion Week catching up with her. But when she closed her eyes that first night, she could not shake the sensation that she was not alone. The mirror in the bathroom seemed to watch her, its surface too reflective, too clear, and when she finally fell asleep, it was restless and shallow, filled with dreams she could not remember, but that left her feeling unsettled. At 2 a.m, she woke to the sound of tapping, soft and rhythmic, like fingernails against glass. She lay still, listening, trying to place the sound, and realized it was coming from the bathroom. The tapping continued, patient and deliberate, and she felt her heart begin to race. She sat up slowly, the sheets tangled around her legs, and stared at the thin line of light beneath the bathroom door. The tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse, heavy and waiting, and she knew she had to look, had to confirm that there was nothing there. She swung her legs out of bed and walked across the cold floor, her hand reaching for the bathroom door, and when she pushed it open, the light blinded her for a moment. The mirror was fogged with condensation, thick and uneven, and in the center, clear as day, was a handprint, small and delicate, fingers splayed like someone had pressed their palm against the glass from the other side. Shanghai had always intimidated her, not because of the crowds or the language barrier, but because of the way the city felt layered, old and new stacked on top of each other, histories buried under steel and glass. The hotel was one of the most luxurious in the city, a towering structure of black marble and gold accents, catering to celebrities and business moguls who valued privacy above all else. Her suite was on the 23rd floor, a sprawling space with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Huangpu River, the kind of view that should have been breathtaking but instead felt isolating, as though she were suspended above the world rather than part of it. The decor was modern and minimalist, everything sharp lines and muted tones. But there were touches of traditional Chinese art, silk scrolls on the walls, porcelain vases on lacquered tables, details that felt more performative than genuine. She had arrived late in the evening, her team dropping her off before scattering to their own accommodations, and she had been too tired to do anything but shower and collapse into bed. The bathroom was enormous, all white marble and chrome fixtures, with a bathtub large enough to swim in, and a mirror that covered an entire wall. She remembered standing in front of it after her shower, wiping away the steam, and feeling a strange reluctance to look at her own reflection, as though something else might be looking back. She had dismissed the thought, blaming jet lag and the strange energy of the city, and gone to bed without another thought. But the feeling had not left. It had only grown stronger, settling into the room like a presence she could not see but could always feel. The next morning, she mentioned the condensation to the front desk, asking if there was an issue with the ventilation, and the receptionist had smiled politely and assured her that maintenance would check the room. No one came. That night, she went to a fitting, spent hours being pinned and measured and photographed, and returned to the suite late, her body aching and her mind numb. She ordered room service, ate half of it, and climbed into bed, determined to sleep properly this time. The room was cold, the air conditioning running at full blast despite her attempts to adjust it, and she pulled the blankets up to her chin, staring at the ceiling. She must have dozed off, because when she opened her eyes again, the room was dark except for the faint glow of the city outside, and the tapping had returned. This time it was louder, more insistent, and she sat up immediately, her pulse spiking. She reached for her phone, the light from the screen harsh and bright, and checked the time. 2:00 in the morning, the exact same time as the night before. The tapping continued, and she realized it was not random. It had a rhythm, a pattern, like someone trying to communicate. She got out of bed and walked toward the bathroom, her phone clutched in her hand, the light casting long shadows across the walls. She stopped at the doorway and looked inside. The mirror was fogged again, completely covered in condensation, and as she watched, the handprint appeared, not all at once, but slowly, as though someone were pressing their hand against the glass in real time. She took a step back, her breath catching, and the handprint grew clearer, the lines of the palm visible, the fingers small and thin, unmistakably not her own. She whispered a question, asking if anyone was there, her voice trembling, and the condensation seemed to ripple, spreading outward from the handprint like water disturbed by a stone. She turned and ran back to the bed, grabbing her phone and calling the front desk, her words tumbling out in a rush, telling them someone was in her room, that they needed to send security immediately. The voice on the other end remained calm, assuring her that someone would be there right away, and she sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the bathroom door, waiting. Security arrived within minutes. 2 men in dark suits who moved through the suite methodically, checking the closets, the balcony, the bathroom, every corner and crevice where someone might hide. They found nothing, no signs of forced entry, no indication that anyone had been inside except her. One of them asked if she had left the bathroom door open, if the steam from a shower might have caused the condensation, and she shook her head, insisting that she had not showered, that the room was freezing, that there was no reason for the mirror to fog. They exchanged glances, the kind of look that said they thought she was overreacting, and told her they would check the ventilation system, that perhaps there was a leak. They left, and she was alone again, the suite feeling, larger and emptier than before. She did not go back to sleep. She sat on the couch in the living area, wrapped in a blanket, her phone in her hand, scrolling through messages and trying to distract herself. But her eyes kept drifting back to the bathroom, to the dark doorway that seemed to pulse with a presence she could not explain. At some point, the sky began to lighten, the city waking up outside her windows, and she finally allowed herself to relax, telling herself that whatever had happened was over, that it had been a fluke, a trick of exhaustion and unfamiliar surroundings. But deep down, she knew better. She knew that something in that room was not right, that the mirror had shown her something she was not supposed to see, and that whatever it was not finished with her. When her assistant arrived later that morning to go over the day's schedule, Kendall asked, as casually as she could, if there was anything unusual about the hotel. if anyone else had reported strange experiences. Her assistant frowned, saying she had not heard anything, but offered to ask around. An hour later, she returned with a story told to her by one of the makeup artists who had worked in Shanghai for years. The hotel, she said, had been built on the site of an old opium house, a place where addicts came to escape reality and where many had died, their bodies left to rot in rooms no one wanted to enter. During construction, workers had reportedly found bones, remnants of a past the city wanted to forget, and there had been whispers of strange occurrences ever since, mirrors fogging without explanation, cold spots in certain rooms, the feeling of being watched. The 23rd floor, in particular, was known among staff as problematic, though management never acknowledged it publicly. Kendall felt her stomach turn, the pieces clicking into place, the handprint, the tapping, the cold that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. She asked which rooms on the 23rd the floor were affected, and her assistant hesitated before admitting that she did not know, but that the makeup artist had suggested switching hotels if Kendall felt uncomfortable. She did not need to be told twice. She packed her bags immediately, telling her team she wanted to move to a different location, citing noise and poor sleep as the reasons. No one questioned her, though she could see the concern in their eyes, the unspoken understanding that something had shaken her. Before she left, she walked back into the bathroom one last time, standing in front of the mirror, searching for any sign of the handprint. The glass was clear, perfectly clean, as though nothing had ever been there. But as she turned to leave, she caught a flicker of movement in the reflection, a shadow passing behind her, quick and fleeting. She spun around, her heart pounding, but the room was empty. She left without looking back, pulling the door shut behind her and walking quickly to the elevator, her bags trailing behind her. The hotel staff were polite but distant as she checked out, their expressions neutral, as though they had seen this before, as though they knew exactly why she was leaving. One of the housekeepers, an older woman with tired eyes, approached her as she waited for a car, speaking in broken English. She said that the mirrors in the hotel sometimes remembered faces, that the dead did not always rest, especially in places built on suffering. She told Kendall not to worry, that the spirits were not malicious, only sad, only looking for someone to see them. Kendall thanked her, though the words brought little comfort, and climbed into the waiting car, watching the hotel disappear behind her as they drove away. She never spoke about the experience publicly, brushing off questions about her sudden hotel change with vague references to scheduling conflicts and personal preference. But those close to her noticed a change, a wariness that had not been there before, a reluctance to stay in certain places, to sleep in rooms that felt too old or too quiet. She began traveling with sage, burning it in hotel rooms before settling in, a habit she had picked up from a friend who believed in cleansing spaces of negative energy. She would laugh it off when asked, saying it helped her relax, but the truth was deeper, rooted in the memory of that handprint, the way it had appeared as though someone were reaching out from the other side, desperate to be acknowledged. She thought about the housekeeper's words often, the idea that mirrors could remember, that they held images of those who had looked into them, trapped forever in glass and silver. It made her uneasy, made her avoid her own reflection sometimes, wondering what other faces might be layered beneath her own, what other hands might press against the surface when she was not looking. The experience in Shanghai stayed with her, not as a fear, but as a reminder, a knowledge that the world was stranger and sadder than she had ever imagined, that the past did not simply fade, but lingered, waiting for someone to notice, someone to care. She never returned to that hotel, never even looked at pictures of it, as though even the image might bring back the feeling of that room, the cold and the tapping, and the presence that had watched her from the other side of the mirror. And sometimes, late at night, when she was alone in a new city, she would wake to the sound of tapping, faint and distant, and she would lie still, listening, wondering if it was following her, if the handprint had marked her in some way, binding her to something she could not escape. But the sound would fade, and she would fall back asleep, telling herself it was nothing, just the pipes, or the wind, or her own mind playing tricks. Yet she never fully believed it, and she never would, because she had seen what she had seen, and no amount of rationalization could erase the memory of that small, delicate hand pressing against the glass, as though pleading to be let in. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Tomorrow we will be uploading another terrifying story. Feel free to subscribe and put on your notifications to never miss another scary video. I upload almost every day. Wish you all the best.